The Coronavirus Act is back in the House of Commons today, with MPs likely to vote to renew the ostensibly temporary powers for the third time, another 6 months of the Act. Well, this Act originally introduced in March 2020 after just 13 hours of debate. It gave the government an extraordinary amount of powers and triggered the greatest loss of liberty in our lifetimes. Many believe this was necessary to mitigate the pandemic, but are we still in an emergency now? And for how much longer can the government justify holding these emergency powers? Well, joining me to talk about this is Alistair Carmichael, the Liberal Democrats MP for Orkney and Shetland. Thank you for joining us here on The Briefing, and welcome, Alistair. First of all, how will you be voting on the renewal of this Act?
Well, if it comes to a division, if there's actually going to be a vote, then Liberal Democrats will vote against it, because we voted against it in September last year, we voted against it in March, and we'll be consistent in that. I have to say, though, the heat has somewhat gone out of this issue today, because, frankly, the government have kind of given up on the most obnoxious parts of this Act. So the powers to restrict assembly, the really serious imposition and removal of our freedoms have all been taken out. They've been expired, and it's left now as a fairly sort of minor piece of legislation dealing with the registration of doctors and social workers. So, I think they've taken the pragmatic view that he who fights and runs away lives to fight another day. But believe me, this is not the end of the story as far as our freedoms are concerned. It's pretty clear that they're still pursuing the idea of COVID vaccine passports, for example. Although they keep saying they've given up on the idea, somehow or another, it's that zombie idea that you just can't kill. So, I think there will be bigger, more important days for our freedoms to come.
Now, when I've spoken to government spokespeople about this Act, they've said that it's important to keep and retain it for things like the evictions ban, and those are the sort of technicalities it covers. Are you supportive of those sort of impositions on liberties, although liberties of people who are landlords, perhaps, and other other parts of the economy? Potentially, some people may see them as freedoms.
Well, some of these restrictions, and really what is left now is really, detailed regulatory stuff. As I say, the regulation of, doctors, social workers, nurses, that sort of thing. The right of coroners to hold an inquest without a jury, that sort of stuff. Important in itself, and, but compared to what there was in that Act, and as you said yourself in your introduction there, Tom, this was introduced, in 3 days, 2 of which were spent in the House of Lords. So MPs have only really substantially debated this for 1 day. And, once it was clear how the pandemic was going to work, there really was no need. Government have held on to these powers at least for a year more than they needed to. And in fact, they could probably have expired quite a lot of them a long time ago, before even the end of the first part of the 6-month renewal in September last year.
Now, one of the things that's been taken out of this Act is this ability to close down schools. And this Act, as far as I understand it, is an Act that covers the United Kingdom. It's not just an England Act. So potentially, what's happening today, if this is renewed and the power to close schools is taken out of it, it puts Nicola Sturgeon in a very precarious position if she wishes to, unlike other countries in the United Kingdom, if she chooses to close down schools, the legal basis for that is somewhat undermined.
I suspect, look, I don't know the actual detail of that as far as devolution is concerned, but there are probably other powers there that she could or would be able to use if that was really what she wanted to do. But, if Nicola Sturgeon wants to take the power to herself, and, you see the way they're using COVID passports in Scotland, they're no great defenders of individual liberty in the SNP, let me tell you, then she can take it to the Scottish Parliament and get that power for herself. Look, when we were dealing with this to start with, in March of 2020, none of us knew really how the pandemic was going to pan out. We didn't know how possible it would be to have any sort of parliamentary input. We were really taking a step into the dark. It was sensible at that point to give fairly wide powers to the government and to take it on trust. But, time and time again, you see this. Every time you give government, give the state power over your life, then they are never going to be fast to hand it back. And that's what you're seeing here.
Absolutely. I think that's the story that we saw at the end of the Second World War. It's a story that we've seen now as well.
Yeah. And it happens all the time. It was perfectly reasonable during the Second World War to require people to carry identity cards. But then it took a private citizen, actually a Liberal candidate of the day, to go to court in 1951, actually to challenge the continuation of these emergency powers 6 years after the war was ended. And actually, this is relevant to today as well. Government is determined to restrict the access of citizens to the courts through judicial review. That would be the mechanism that you would take today. And, that's why these things are all connected and that's why they all matter. Freedom of the individuals can only be guaranteed by free and fair courts.
It's really, really heartening to see the Liberal Democrats standing up for individual liberty. I wonder if, as more people who've potentially been attracted to the Conservative Party in previous years are now looking more to your party, if there's a sort of avenue for people who believe in relatively small state and sovereign individuals. Is the Liberal Democrats a party for them?
Well, look, it's always the case that Conservatives will be libertarian in opposition and authoritarian in government. And it's always the case. It was the case right back when I was fairly new as an MP in 2005, when the then Labour Party wanted to introduce identity cards across the board. There has always got to be a party that, when it comes to regulating that relationship between the citizen and the state, will always stand on the side of the individual and will always hold the state to account for the powers they take and how they use them. That's why I am a Liberal. That's why I joined this party, believe it or not, as a 14-year-old, because it's what matters to me. And, it doesn't matter whether we're going to be the next government or not. What matters to me is that there's a party here that will stand up for individual freedoms. It's the defining characteristic of what it means to be a Liberal.
Well, Alistair Carmichael, thank you so much for sharing that story. I didn't know you joined at the age of 14. Incredible. But thank you for joining us and giving us that perspective here on The Briefing.